All right, so in this video, we're going to continue talking about revolutions. And in this case, we're going to start a long series of discussions about political revolutions. And we're going to start with the first one of these, and we're going to talk today about the American Revolution. And in order to talk about the American Revolution, we also have to tie in some Enlightenment ideas. So we're going to talk about the American Revolution and some more Enlightenment ideas. So the American Revolution actually comes out of three different, I guess we would call them strands, come together to create the American Revolution. So we'll do these in chronological order. The first one of these is the English Civil War. Now, when we thought about the English Civil War, we briefly talked about this and how it gave us the idea of constitutional monarchy in England. It also gave us the English Bill of Rights. Now, among other things, the English Bill of Rights protected certain civil rights, like freedom of speech. And this is where we get a lot of the ideas from the American Bill of Rights. So they came from the English Bill of Rights. But on top of that, and this is a very important point, it also specified that Parliament had the right to approve all taxes. This was a big reason why the English Civil War started in the first place. One of the reasons why the English Civil War started was over who has the right to approve taxes. Can the king do it? Does the king need Parliament's consent or advice in creating a new tax? And so what the English Bill of Rights said is that Parliament had the right to approve all taxes. Okay, so that's number one. The second of these three different strands is the 7 Years' War. So the 7 Years' War was 1756 to 1763. So the 7 Years' War, remember we talked about this as a war over trade routes, and if you remember, we said that the French lost and the United Kingdom won. And so the British got to keep a lot of the trade routes and colonies in North America. Now, there is a subsection of the 7 Years' War, the North American section of this war. In North America, we call this the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War, it's called that because that's who the British were fighting. They were fighting the French and they were fighting the Indians. It's a misnomer, and it's probably not super politically correct to call it that, but that's the name of the war. So the North American theater of the 7 Years' War was called the French and Indian War. And it was really expensive. And it cost the British a lot of money. So, to recoup this money, the British government put new taxes on their colonies to help pay for the war, which is a completely reasonable thing to ask because this war was meant to protect their colonists. And so they're asking the colonists to pay taxes to pay for the war that was just fought to defend them from the French. So this is the first thread, that Parliament has the right to approve all taxes. The second thread says that the government puts these new taxes on the colonies to help pay for this war. Here is the third thread, and this is some new material. So here we're going to bring up some new Enlightenment ideas. Specifically, these ideas are the ideas of popular sovereignty, and connected to popular sovereignty is the concept of the social contract. So, up until this point, kings ruled because they had authority from God. That's what gave kings legitimate power. They had authority from God. But this new idea of popular sovereignty said that authority comes from the people. Or in other words, the consent of the governed. That the people who are being ruled have to consent to be ruled. It's not just that you have power from God, it's that the people have to agree that you are in charge. And so, connected to this is this idea of the social contract. Now, this is a metaphorical contract. Between the people and the government. It's not a real contract. You don't sign anything when you're born. It's a metaphorical contract between the people and the government. In this contract, the people agree to be governed in return for something. Now, there are three types of social contract ideas, and I'm going to briefly mention the three different types because each one of them is going to be kind of important for understanding what's going to happen in all of these different revolutions we're going to look at. So, the first guy, his name is Thomas Hobbes, and he wrote a very famous book called The Leviathan. And he wrote The Leviathan. Of course, I didn't write it down, but I think he wrote this in the 1660s. And basically, what Hobbes says is that people are awful and need something big and powerful to keep us from killing each other. And that big, awful thing to keep us from killing each other is the government. In fact, that's what a Leviathan is. A Leviathan is a monster. And he's saying that people are little monsters, and we need a bigger, more powerful monster to keep all of us little monsters from killing each other. And so for Hobbes, we give up our absolute freedom in return for protection. That's what Hobbes says. We give up our right to run around and kill each other and steal and do whatever we want. And in return for giving up that absolute freedom to do whatever we want, we get protection. All right, so that is one idea of the social contract. Here is another idea of the social contract, and this one is much more influential. This is written by a guy named John Locke. So John Locke, this guy is Thomas Hobbes, just in case anybody wants their first names. Thomas Hobbes, John Locke. John Locke wrote a really important book called Two Treatises on Government. And he writes this, I want to say, in the 1730s, although I might be wrong on that one. The date isn't really that important. What is important is this. For Locke, he takes Hobbes's ideas and makes it a little bit more nuanced. So he still thinks people are bad, but we can be reasoned with. People can be reasoned with. And people like a good deal. They like a good contract. And so here's the deal that John Locke writes about in Two Treatises of Government. He says, people will give up their absolute freedom, just like Hobbes says, in return for the government protecting your natural rights. Okay, what are natural rights? These are rights you are born with. and Locke names 3 of them. You have the right to live, you have the right to liberty, and you have the right to property. He specifically mentions property, which tells us that he is definitely a capitalist. So you give up your absolute freedoms. In return, the government will protect your right to live, your right to be free, and your right to own property. But he throws in another clause into the contract. If the government does not protect your rights, you have the authority to overthrow the government and create a new one that will. So if the government isn't protecting your rights, you have the right to overthrow that government and create a new one. This idea is going to be super important for influencing all of these revolutionaries we're about to get to know. The third guy, so Hobbes, Locke, were both English. The third guy is French, and his name is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He has kind of a different idea on the social contract. In fact, his most famous work is called The Social Contract. And he writes this in the 1760s. And in Rousseau's idea of the social contract, he writes about this idea called the general will. The general will says this: people are good. And so in this sense, he's really different from Hobbes and Locke. He thinks people are good. And he says, whatever the people agree upon is good and should be implemented. Like, that's what the government should be. What the people agree upon is good because people are good. And so whatever their general consensus is, or their general will, is good. And that's what we should be doing. And that sounds awesome. It kind of sounds democratic and, following an election, everybody has a say in what happens. And that does definitely influence the ideas of democracy, but it can also be used to say, like, well, maybe we should start chopping heads off. Do we agree on that? Yes? Okay, then we'll start chopping heads off. There's definitely some good sides to what Rousseau says, but there's also some definite red flags that come up. All right, so we took a quick sojourn through these new Enlightenment ideas that are going to be really important for understanding the American Revolution. So just to recap where we are right now, these are our 3 threads that are coming together to understand what happens in the American Revolution. First, remember, Parliament has the right to approve all new taxes. The British won this war, the French lost this war, and these colonies are being taxed to pay for the war that was just fought to defend them. And then finally, this third thread, these ideas of popular sovereignty and the social contract, these ideas are going to really influence what's about to happen in the American colonies. So now let's jump into the American Revolution. So we're not going to dwell on the American Revolution too much. One, because this is world history and we don't want to dwell too much on any one particular event like this. And two, you cover this a lot in American history. So we're not going to dwell on it too much. But we are going to kind of connect it into the rest of our story here. So following the North American section of the 7 Years' War, the United Kingdom imposed new taxes on American colonists, which is fine, but here's the sticky part. American colonists are not represented in the British Parliament. There are no American colonists in the British Parliament. So American colonists start looking at what John Locke says, especially about the government protecting your property. And they also think about what the English Bill of Rights says. And it says that Parliament has the right to approve all taxes, but we don't have any say in this Parliament. Which leads to the big rallying cry of the American Revolution: no taxation without representation. And it always helps if your slogans rhyme, and this one does. So no taxation without representation. And very technically, they're right. They don't have a say in the Parliament. The Parliament gets to approve taxes. They should have a say in the Parliament. But you can also kind of see the British point of view saying, we just fought this war to protect you and defend you. Pay your share. So there's a side, you can see both sides of the argument there. So when this happens, a bunch of radical colonists refuse to pay their taxes. And when I say a bunch, this means that it's not a lot. It's a few, not a lot of them. It's really a small percentage of the population. But they refuse to pay their taxes. They organize boycotts and destroy British property. Most famously, they throw a bunch of British tea into Boston Harbor, giving us the Boston Tea Party. So things between the British government and the British colonies in North America starts to get more and more tense. And eventually, the 13 colonies unite to create the Continental Congress to organize all their actions, because at this point they are 13 separate governments. And this creates the United States. Because at this point, they are 13 separate states, all doing their own thing. And now they're using this body to unite their actions. And so instead of 13 separate states, they become the United States. And they're going to issue a Declaration of Independence. On July the 4th, 1776. That's when it's published. It was actually written and signed on the 2nd, but this is the day that we celebrate in the United States as Independence Day. And so the war kicked off a little bit before that. The war starts in kind of autumn of April of 1775. And it goes pretty poorly until the French and really a lot of other Europeans get involved. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that they don't get involved because they like Americans. They get involved to knock the British back a little. That's why they get involved. They don't particularly care for the Americans. They think that this is a bad idea. A lot of them think this is a bad idea. You can't fight your king. It sets a bad example. And the French are going to learn this the hard way in about 15 years. But the French get involved because they want to knock the British back. They want a little revenge. The French want revenge and control of the Atlantic shipping routes. And so the Americans would not have won. The Americans win this war in 1783 only because of French aid. The Americans would not have won this war without the French. But, and we'll set this up for next time, the Americans give the shipping routes and the trade back to the British, basically slapping the French in the face. And in the long run, this is going to bankrupt France. But we'll worry about France in our next couple of videos, because what's about to happen in France is going to have global consequences, big time consequences all over the world. So yes, it's really important for France and Europe, but it's going to unleash a bunch of new ideas that's going to shape the 19th century that we're about to start talking about. So in our next two videos, we'll talk about what's going on in France and why the ideas that are about to be unleashed are going to have such big time consequences. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.